Okay. Started. Very good. My name is Marty West. I serve as academic dean here at HGSE, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this celebration of Ben Wildavsky's important new book, The Career Arts. It is no secret that American higher education is under a lot of stress right now, with families and students increasingly questioning the value of a college degree and advocates increasingly calling on employers to hire based on skills rather than degrees. So it's in that environment that Ben's book serves as both a guidebook and a bit of a reality check. It underlines the strong evidence for the continued economic value of a college degree. It explains the strengths, limitations, and how to select among the most effective alternative post-secondary credentials. It urges readers to reject the false choice of either or when it comes to acquiring broad and targeted skills in post-secondary education, and instead to embrace a both and approach. It highlights the importance of building social capital in post-secondary education as a key element of career success, particularly for students without many inherited advantages. And it does all of this in just 159 pages, including endnotes, which means that some people outside of this room may actually read it. And as Ben and I discussed, makes it a much more challenging feat to write than some 500-page tome. So that's a bit about the book. Let me tell you a little bit about its author. Ben Wildavsky is a longtime education journalist and a thought leader who's currently a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. His experience includes leadership and research roles at Strata Education Network, the Brookings Institution, the Kauffman Foundation, and U.S. News and World Report. He previously authored The Great Brain Race, a book I highly recommend, and his bylines as a journalist include the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic Foreign Policy, and the Washington Post. We also have two outstanding panelists to share their reactions to Ben's book and join him in conversation. First is Dave Deming, my counterpart as academic dean at the Harvard Kennedy School, and still, I'm proud to say, a professor of education here at HGSE. And then we have Maria Flynn, CEO of Jobs for the Future, an organization that seeks to transform the U.S. education and workforce systems to create more equitable economic advancement. And moderating that panel will be John Marcus, a veteran and highly respected journalist focused on American higher education. So we have a great lineup, and without further ado, let me invite Ben up to get us started.
Thank you very much, Marty, for the kind introduction, and I'm really just delighted to be here. Something's been puzzling me for a long time, and I'm going to tell you what it is. Honestly, if you follow the news or just talk to friends and family, you've probably heard this already. In huge numbers, Americans worry about the value of college. And there's so much skepticism that, as Marty mentioned, there's now a big campaign to get rid of degree requirements for many state government and corporate jobs. The idea is to hire based on skills, not degrees, which are presented as a barrier instead of a gateway to opportunity. Now, look, most people go to college to get good jobs and to get ahead in life. And with rising tuition and student debt, and with critics complaining about cancel culture and classes that are irrelevant to real life, I guess it's natural for Americans to wonder whether they will get good ROI on their investment in college. The reason this puzzles me, though, is that the data and evidence are actually very clear. A record number of Americans have degrees, and they're earning way more money than people who only graduated from high school. And if you look at what employers do, instead of what they say, they still have a strong preference for hiring people with degrees. So what's behind the skepticism? Why are people so uncertain about whether college is worthwhile? A clue to the answer came to me in a conversation with someone I think many of you know, David Deming, an economist here at Harvard, that started off being about the value of college. One day, David and I took a walk right near here along the Charles River here in Cambridge. One of us with a PhD in economics and a distinguished professional record, The other, a former journalist with zero professional training, but of course with lots of opinions. And I wanted to jump right in and talk about the detailed evidence for the financial benefits of college. But David urged me to make a shift in how I think about this topic. He said, you're thinking about this in terms of where people go. Do they go to college or do they go to non-degree programs? But what if instead you ask the question, what do they actually need to know? In other words, he very politely flipped my script. It's not what does college provide, he told me, it's what do students need to succeed in the workforce over a lifetime. It was a fundamental bit of redirection, and it really got me thinking. Maybe a clue to why people are skeptical is not about college itself, but because they're unsure about what they're really going to need in a changing economy. A lot of us are really wondering, what do students need for successful careers? And that's what I want to explore with you today. Before we do, though, let's just take a brief look at the numbers. For decades, the United States has widely embraced college as a vital pathway to upward mobility. By 2021, the percentage of American adults with a four-year college degree or higher was greater than ever before, 37.8%. But in July, just a few months ago, a Gallup poll found Americans' confidence in higher education had fallen to a new low of 36%. That's down from 54% in 2015. And I see that Julia Palillo, my research assistant, is here, a Harvard graduate. I'm delighted to see you, and I can tell you that statistic is accurate because Julia helped make sure it was. And you know, it's not just something that people are telling pollsters. It's happening in real life. College enrollment is plummeting. It dropped 8% in just 3 years between 2019 and 2022. And it's reached the point where there's now what you've heard about, this big push that I mentioned to have states and private employers hire based on skills rather than relying so much on degrees. And to me, this ties into this very popular view that there's a fundamental trade-off between pure academics and job-relevant skills. In other words, do we need more philosophers or more welders? But before we reject college in favor of practical skills, let's take a look at what's behind this worldview. I want to suggest to you that all these changes in public sentiment are really about something bigger. This isn't really about college per se. It's about the desire for job satisfaction and financial success over the long term in a changing economy. When people say they're worried about degrees, what they're really worried about is building a secure career. And what are the core factors in career success? To answer that, we'll have to make a second shift. We'll have to get rid of our one-dimensional view of what it takes to succeed. We have to look at the big picture. And that's why I called my new book The Career Arts. Not the liberal arts, although I love the liberal arts. Not the vocational arts, although targeted skills have their place, but the career arts, because this is about how individuals can put together the right mixture of ingredients to prosper professionally over the long term. And those ingredients, I believe, fall into three categories, which are outlined in the subtitle of my book, Making the Most of College, Credentials, and Connections. What people need for lifelong professional success today are three things: broad education, targeted skills, and social capital. And I'm going to explain why each of those three elements is important, but I also want you to join me in seeing how they fit together, something like a balanced diet for a healthy career. It's usually best to start not with theory, but with how things actually work in the real world, which for our purpose means the job market. And that's where I want to start today. What do employers really need? When I began on this book, I was struck by a big study that came out a few years ago from the labor market analytics firm Burning Glass, now called Lightcast. The study looked at something very interesting: the mixture of technical and creative thinking required by a growing number of what they called hybrid jobs. Hybrid jobs combine right brain social skills and left brain technical skills. And the study found much faster growth in those jobs than in other kinds of jobs. And get this, it also found that hybrid jobs that combine, say, advertising and data science skills pay more. So a marketing manager who knows the database program SQL, according to this analysis, can earn an average of $100,000 annually. And that's about 41% more than the $70,000 a year earned by a colleague who does not have those SQL skills. We also know that when employers hire, they consistently prize qualities like the ability to work in teams, problem-solving skills, and written and verbal communications. What does this mean? We have to move away from an either-or approach to degrees or vocational training and toward a both-and education that covers both broad and targeted skills. That's what the labor market is asking for. So we have to take that both-and approach. Okay, but what does it mean for educational and career planning? For one thing, it means we shouldn't leap to conclude that a technically focused college degree is the most useful kind. It's something David Deming has written about. Specific skills like computer languages are very useful, but they have a fairly short half-life. You know, when I was in college back in the dark ages, I learned some basic computer programming, even though I was a comp lit major, but I learned how to program in BASIC. But I think probably even by the time I graduated, a few years later, I don't know if people were using BASIC anymore. So it's very important to have the broad transferable abilities that help you learn new things and navigate change. In fact, interestingly, a lot of the people who sign up for non-degree credentials already have college degrees. They're looking to supplement what they studied with something different or something more targeted. Think about coding boot camps or the hugely popular MOOC classes that were so much the rage, 10 or 12 years ago. One person I feature in my book is a guy named John Thibault down in Rhode Island. He was a high school teacher. He got laid off. He wanted to do something totally different, something very practical. So he ended up going to CCRI, the Community College of Rhode Island, and he enrolled in a 19-week boot camp in advanced manufacturing. And he got a really good job very quickly. So the labor market wants broad skills, and it also wants targeted skills. And of course, you also have to find out about what jobs are available. You need to have a network of people who can not only tell you about opportunities, but who can vouch for your abilities. So let's dive in and talk briefly about each of these three in order: college, credentials, and connections. We'll start with college. The first point I want to make, and it really can't be overstated, is that despite all the angst, despite all the chatter about college degrees being overrated, there really remains a massive base of evidence for their economic benefits. Despite rising tuition, despite worries about student debt, college graduates still earn an average of 75% more each year than their peers with just a high school diploma. So you're probably asking yourself why. It's because degrees provide a package of broad and targeted skills. You all know the ivory tower stereotype. You all, of course, and have heard and seen the campus culture wars. But we shouldn't forget that a lot of people have very career-oriented majors. Things like business, teaching, nursing, accounting, those are the really popular majors. And plenty of liberal arts majors, people who study things like history or English, they often go on to professional school in fields like law and medicine, very career-focused. Now, of course, there are some absolutely legitimate concerns about the payoff to college degrees. The overall figures on the economic payoff that I've just mentioned are averages. The economic returns vary, and they vary quite a lot based on subject study. In addition, and this is perhaps the greatest real failing of American higher education, is that completion rates are really worryingly low. Only 62% of first-time, full-time undergraduates get a degree from that institution, from the same institution, within 6 years. Now, these are really important concerns, but in my view, none of them are reasons to be fundamentally skeptical of degrees. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot we can do to give students the navigational help that they need to make good decisions about what to study, and there's a lot we can do to keep improving graduation rates. Okay, so I've talked about degrees. What about the second leg of the stool, non-degree credentials? The first thing to say about these alternative credentials is that we need them. For all the benefits of traditional 2- and 4-year degrees, many learners need something different. They may not be interested in more classroom time. They may want immediate hands-on work experience, and they may have a very practical desire and a need to earn money right away. We also know that alternative credentials are really popular, and the number is exploding. There's a nonprofit credential engine that does a sort of annual report. They have identified more than 1 million different credentials, and more than 3/4 of those are not traditional degrees. But this is a big landscape, and it's very confusing. How can potential students figure out how to separate the wheat from the chaff? And let me tell you what I mean by that. There are some programs, which are known as sectoral training programs, which get very good results. They offer a clear path to success, and that means they're focused on high-demand sectors, things like information technology, financial services. They include training in specific skills, as well as long-term career skills like critical thinking. And they lead to jobs that can be building blocks to better paying jobs in the same sector. Let's say you go near here, you go to Bunker Hill Community College in Boston. You can get an IT certification, and that leads to help desk jobs that pay about 60% more than average. And they also position you for better jobs in the same sector. But a lot of short-term programs are much more problematic because they're more of a dead end. They're one and done. And this is actually something Joe Fuller from the Project on Workforce here at Harvard told me about. You can go to Bunker Hill Community College, the same place, take the same number of credits and become a certified nursing assistant, which really doesn't give you a big earnings boost. And it doesn't have a lot of prospects for advancement. It's what one expert I talked to called a complete island. Another person I interviewed, the Amazon executive who ran the company's career choice program for employee education benefits, she calls these cul-de-sac jobs, where you get a certification, but then you're kind of stuck. And the difference between short-term programs that create a real pathway and those that lead to a dead end is especially worrisome if you know that racial and ethnic minorities, as well as women and older adults, are disproportionately likely to enroll in less effective short-term programs. So on the one hand, you have people who say degree requirements are unfair barriers to Black and Latino workers. But on the other hand, if we're not careful what we pick, we're steering Black and Latino students toward non-degree credentials, these alternatives that can put them on a less desirable pathway to a kind of second-class citizenship. This is a real risk, and I think we have to take it seriously. Now, one way to mitigate that risk is to focus on what are called stackable credentials. You know, it's a little jargony, but it's important. It means short-term credentials that students can earn one by one, maybe while they're working, they may have families and responsibilities, but over time, they can combine them into a degree that will improve their career prospects, maybe lead to a raise, maybe lead to a better job. And that's a deliberate effort to stack up those individual credentials to create a pathway instead of a dead end. But of course, we know that mixing targeted skills and broad education, even when you do it right, is only part of the story. And that brings me to the third ingredient of career success, social capital. The old line that it's not just what you know, it's who you know. It's not just something your parents tell you, it's true. Social capital is defined as the ability to access and mobilize networks. And if you're trying to build a career, networks are vital. Back in the early 1970s, here at Harvard, a PhD student, the sociologist Mark Granovetter, interviewed men in the Boston suburbs, and he asked them about how they learned about the jobs that they held. And he would ask them if the person who told them about their current job was a friend. And he kept hearing the same thing over and over. No, just an acquaintance. And he ended up writing this article called The Strength of Weak Ties, which showed that people don't just find out about jobs from their inner circle. They find jobs when the circle widens. And it became one of the most cited articles ever in social science. So clearly, networks really matter, both for finding out about jobs and for advancing in the job that you're in. It's no surprise that this is a particular challenge for people who grow up without a lot of advantages, including low-income job seekers and including first-generation college students. Thankfully, there are a lot of nonprofits, places like Graven, Co-op Careers, Project Basta, there's Climb Higher in the San Francisco Bay Area, that are focusing on this. And they're making concerted efforts to build social capital for low-income college students and for recent graduates. I was really impressed, for example, with a young woman I met while I was working on the book called Farzana Chowdhury. She came from Bangladesh to Brooklyn when she was 17 years old. Her parents run a newsstand in Brooklyn. She went to Brooklyn College, also my parents' alma mater back in the 1950s, so it's a place that's dear to my family. And she was pretty happy with the education that she received, but she did not feel prepared for a career, whether that was interview skills or how to create a great LinkedIn profile. Farzana succeeded. She's now working in digital marketing at Disney because she was able to complete the puzzle by developing a network of peers and by acquiring some immediately marketable skills by joining this program that I mentioned, Co-op Careers. So where does all this lead us? When I put together all these pieces, which I call the career arts, I think back to the paradox that I started with. Americans are conflicted about college. Many embrace it, but they also mistrust it. And they want more alternatives. Part of the solution is for more people to move away from a one-dimensional view and instead to look at the big picture. That's those three main components that I've been talking about: broad skills, targeted education, and social capital. They might pursue the career arts in college, where there is a sort of one-stop shopping effect where you can get a lot of those in one place. They might assemble those elements separately, maybe over time. But what matters is that they're thinking about long-term success and they're taking charge of what they need to achieve it. Looking forward, I think we're going to see more higher ed institutions adopting this both-and approach in what they offer students. And in fact, some of them already are. I've been fascinated by places like Colorado Mountain College, which has a series of campuses over various mountain communities in Colorado. It's a hybrid of a community college and a four-year school. They serve students who are drawn to specialties like becoming an outdoor guide and who also need to be able to work with spreadsheets, to design a website, to market the business to clients. CMC is working because it has embraced the principle of both and. I began today by talking about the skepticism that surrounds higher education. I've told you why I think college still has a lot of value. But in a way, skepticism is good. We should be asking about what's really working, whether that's in traditional degree programs, alternative credentials, or improved versions of both. Let's take that healthy skepticism and let's use it to make more education more effective for many, many more people. Yes, that should include non-degree pathways. But we should avoid sounding a premature death knell for the degree. It has to be both and. By putting together college, credentials, and connections, we can ensure that students are truly prepared not just for the jobs of the future, but for a whole new world of future careers. We have a lot of challenges, no question. But I think this is an optimistic message. And I'm excited to see what happens next. So thank you very much.
Well, that gives us a lot to talk about, and we will for a few minutes before we invite audience questions. So start thinking of good questions. I see the skepticism that you talked about in high schools, where I find that students have no idea why they should go to high school. There's just to college. There's just not that push, especially in rural high schools and out in the rest of the world, meaning not in Cambridge. So there's just the skepticism is translating into the numbers that you talked about. The proportion of high school graduates going directly to college being down, largely affecting community colleges, but to a degree, they're just rejecting the idea of a post-secondary education at all. So despite your arguments about degree value, this is happening out there in the backdrop. And we also have this massive number, as you mentioned, 1 million alternative credentials with varying levels of acceptance by employers. So let me ask David this one. How do we restore consumers' faith? This is an easy question. How do we restore consumers' faith in college, or instead promote alternatives that actually work?
Can you hear me? There we go. Okay. Tough question, John. So I guess I would say that it starts from understanding the sources of skepticism in the first place, which is something Ben alluded to it a little bit. I think you can throw numbers at people, but one thing that's clear to me, not just in looking at the numbers myself, but in talking to people, is that the fundamental premise of going to college is that it's an investment in an uncertain future. The costs are the bill comes due right away. And, it's, as an economist, you think, well, is a market and how do markets work? And it's not really like most other markets. Like if you go to the supermarket and you buy breakfast cereal and you buy a box of cereal that's on sale and you try it, you don't like it, you just don't buy it next time. Or maybe if your favorite cereal is too expensive, you buy something else. There's a lot of opportunities for feedback and information sharing about, what's the right price? And do I like this thing or that thing? Or I like the peanut butter flavor instead or whatever. And that's just not really how it works with college. You only get to go once and you don't really know whether you made a good investment until years after you went. And so we shouldn't really expect it to work like other markets in terms of information sharing and things like that. And so I think that's where the social networks, the, family and friends telling you that, hey, it may seem uncertain and risky now, but actually your 40-year-old self will thank you for a decision you made a long time ago. You're basically asking people to delay gratification for longer than they've been alive, because if you have a debt, if you're undergoing a lot of student loans to go to college, you might not fully realize the benefits until you're 40 and you're making the decision when you're 17, 18, and maybe your family is, can't afford to help you. And so I think it's just important to recognize all those things, meet people where they are, and to provide some support. I mean, my own view is that the cost of college is too high. It's an easy thing to say, but I think there's more we could do to bring the cost down. I also think that the public conversation is really overwrought because it focuses not on what the average student faces, but what anxious upper middle class New York Times readers face, which is like the price of a really expensive elite college. And public universities average tuition now is like $11,000, $10,000, and many people qualify for financial aid. So even if you're paying for it all on your own dime, you're not borrowing six figures to go to school. And yet, and most people aren't paying sticker price even at private colleges. And so I think there's a little bit of bad faith fear mongering about it that isn't helping. But again, we have to understand the sources of that. Finally, to your question about alternatives, I'm always hesitant. I know I have some colleagues who disagree with me on this. I'm always hesitant to recommend educational programs for other people's kids, to say, well, there's this alternative out there. It's not quite as good, but some of you should do it. I think if we think that college is worth the investment for most people, then we ought to be encouraging most people to go, and we ought to be building the system that can sustainably allow most people to go to benefit from the economic opportunities that that many of us have by virtue of our families or whatever. So I think there are good alternatives for people who ex post college doesn't work for them. So we ought to build a system that works for people who drop out of college or who couldn't go or didn't go for whatever reason to go back to school, get an education in the trades. But to me, that's different than building a system that ex ante kind of funnels people who, don't make the cut into these things. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
So just one follow-up, and it's not about angst-ridden New York Times readers who
always about angst-ridden New York Times readers.
I apologize as a journalist for that. So short of telling other people where to send their kids to college or what other alternatives are available for them, how can we help them understand which alternatives are worth it?
Yeah. So I would say there's a couple of shorthand pieces of advice that I would give, and I have given. One is, go to public school. Unless you're a high income family and can afford it. Like if you're thinking about going to college and you're worried about debt, just to share a personal story, like when I was growing up, I didn't grow up in poverty, but my parents were concerned about the cost of college, and I knew that. And so I very early on knew I was fortunate to get a scholarship to attend the Ohio State University. And that's a decision I made as a 17-year-old, knowing that my parents, could borrow the money, but didn't want to. And that seemed like a good, and it was a lower risk choice because even if I didn't graduate, I wouldn't have been saddled with a bunch of debt because I had a scholarship and I had other ways to go. And so I encourage people to choose those options. That's where 75% of college students go. That's where most of the education is happening. And not every single public college in the country is a good investment, but most of them are. And most of the schools that are bilking people are for-profit universities or nonprofits that are really for-profit, even if it's not their legal designation. So I think there's some shorthand things like that. We can help people. I also think that people need to know that the sticker price is not the price they pay. I think colleges want to be able to price discriminate. And I understand why, because it's a tough balancing act. But people should know that usually the average price people pay is like 50 to 60% of the sticker price. So people should just know that. And they should know that they can actually lobby to get more financial aid later on in the process. There's a lot of things that, for not very good reasons, lead to disparities in access to college and information about low and middle income kids who are academically ready, their ability to go to college and their ability to afford it.
Maria, Ben points out that a number of major companies, including Google, have he said publicly that you can get a job without a bachelor's degree. Interestingly, a lot of governors have said this too, because they're cashing in on the public skepticism, right? But as he also pointed out, what they say it might be different than what they do. Should we, in fact, encourage a system where you can get a job by proving that you have skills, and how would that work?
Yes. Before I answer that, I want to say one thing about David's question really quickly. So one is, I think we're at the early stage of seeing some systems that really could help bring transparency to the quality of the non-degree credentials, right? So one is one that JFF is doing in partnership with the Burning Glass Institute called EQUOS, Education Quality Outcomes Standards. And then another that I would encourage folks to follow is called the Post-Secondary Commission. I just joined the board of it recently, and it's really looking to see how to build a formal accreditor that is focusing its accreditation on economic mobility. So just interesting things that are happening that I hope will get it more possible and easier to have this truly be a both and system, because I don't think it is right now. But on the skills point, I don't really agree with what you said in your New York Times piece, where he was saying it was really a lot of virtue signaling, right? That the governors were making these statements. I would argue that it's early days, right? And I think it is too early to be saying this works or it doesn't work. And we're seeing early signs of progress. We're also seeing early signs of where there's a lot of work yet to be done. So for folks who haven't been following this too closely, there's now 17 governors, both Republicans and Democrats, that have removed degree requirements from their state jobs. Governor Hogan, when he was governor of Maryland, was the first one to do so. It was about 15 months ago now that he made that move. They have seen a 43% increase in hires of workers without degrees just in that first year. So it's about 2,000 workers in total, right? But it's real, it's happening, and those workers are being hired across a number of different fields. On the tech company side, I would argue, I think it's harder to see some of the evidence right now, right? So a lot of companies are saying they're removing their degree requirements, but the hiring isn't really keeping pace as much. So JFF, we're really centering our whole strategy around a skills-based approach or a skills-first approach, but knowing that those changes really need to take place both on the employer side within the hiring practices, but also kind of on the whole ecosystem side, where how are we helping learners and workers really know how to maneuver within a skills-first frame? How do we ensure that those jobs that folks are being hired into without a degree don't turn into the cul-de-sac jobs, right? How do you ensure that there's also skills-based advancement strategies that are built into this process? Just about 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Society for Human Resource Management, and the Business Roundtable co-signed a statement really doubling down on skills as what they're going to focus on, in the near future. So I think that was a pretty big commitment. But I'll also say, as an employer at JFF, small size, but we removed our degree requirements a couple of years ago across the board. But I'd be the first to admit that our hiring, of folks without diplomas hasn't been that great. So it takes work, right? And I think a lot of that comes down to hiring managers. If you look at surveys, a lot of times the C-suite are all in favor of this. When you get down to HR leaders or hiring managers, there's more skepticism. So we have a report called Degrees of Risk that actually does a really interesting analysis, both on the employer side in terms of attitudes towards alternative pathways, as well as interviewing and surveying Gen Z workers and learners about what they're looking for.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, both of you. But I have to say, I was particularly pleased that sorry. Let me try that again. Thank you to both of you for your comments, and I was particularly pleased to have Maria, make a defense of the skills first approach. I knew that you would be one of the best advocates for that, but I have to say I remain skeptical, deeply skeptical. And I have to say the evidence the numbers you showed, from Maryland, are one of the frankly, one of the few concrete signs that I've seen this may really be happening. And I'd really be interested in digging a little deeper into who is getting hired for what kinds of positions, and so forth. What I've seen, and some of you may have seen this, although I don't know that they made a huge public, they didn't make a big public deal of this because LinkedIn has also gotten very committed to this notion of skills first hiring. But LinkedIn did a big survey, and of course they have a huge number of records and data. They looked at, I think it was probably millions of employer job listings over just the past few years, and they found a huge increase in several sectors. The one that comes to mind, I think, was communications, and a few others, maybe 250%, in some cases 300% increases in job listings with no professional degree requirement. So that sort of is consistent with this whole, I will be a little flip, I guess, just like I said, virtue signaling, but it's kind of flavor of the month. You know, skills, degrees are bad and suspect. But they also looked at LinkedIn, at not only how many job listings had dropped the degree requirement, but how many people were hired without degrees. And in the same sectors where there was a 250% increase in job listings without requirements, there was a 3% increase in hires without degrees. That's 3%. And okay, this is one data point. It did cover some major sectors. LinkedIn has big records. I absolutely think it's reasonable to say this is certainly, there are many very smart, good people involved, people with good intentions involved in this movement. Perhaps in 20 years, we will really see this has happened, and we'll have a strong research base showing that it really happened and that it really led to great economic advancement. But I really am concerned that it's feeding into a sort of narrative that says degrees are really not about what economists call a human capital, about actually learning things. They're just about signaling. It's just a piece of paper, the sheepskin effect. So let's get rid of those pesky requirements. It's really all about bureaucrats putting them in there and stopping people getting ahead. Whereas you might say, we have big challenges, especially with various lower income folks, African Americans, Latinos, not doing as well economically because they need to have better education. And it seems to me that it's not because they don't have the piece of paper, it's because they need to have we need better systems and better access to college. So I'm still skeptical.
So can I just say briefly? I mean, I think the skills-based hiring, if you want to call it a movement or something, it's not the flavor of the month. It's the flavor of the tightest labor market in a generation. I think if you look at this from the employer perspective, it makes sense to remove degree requirements because you want to preserve flexibility. It's so hard to hire. You don't want to set unnecessary barriers. That's different than saying, I don't prefer somebody with it. Like, I don't put any tip on the scales. And that's clearly not true, as Ben is saying. So I think from the employer's perspective, they want to preserve flexibility in times when they can't afford to be choosy. But from the student's perspective, you want to preserve flexibility in the other direction. That means, again, the ex-ante distinction. Like, we don't want to have an economy where if you don't get a degree by the time you're 25 years old, your prospects for mobility are zero. So we want to have pathways. At the same time, if you're trying to advise somebody to make a decision about whether they ought to go to college, the answer is clearly yes, because you want to preserve flexibility so that you can get a job when the labor market's not so great. So I think I actually don't find it to be much of a tension. I think it just depends on whose perspective you're taking and what we're trying to accomplish as a society.
Does that mean that when the labor market tightens, that we'll see a return to demand for bachelor's degrees?
Yes, I believe we will, as we have in
That's
generations
not
past.
That's not what our surveys were showing, though. The
Well-
reality might be, but that's not what employers are stating at this point.
We shall see.
Am I going to have to separate you all?
No. I mean, I didn't mean that in a snarky way. Like, I don't know the answer to the next. This time could be different, but I think we've seen this before.
So, Maria, what about Ben's focus on social capital and the ability of students to network? It was, and this one, I am skeptical about the nice story that you told about someone that kind of discovered her own kind of route to networking, into social capital, into friendships, and that could lead to jobs. I think, especially for first generation students, that's a really tough. And someone who you cite in your footnotes wrote once about how first generation students with exactly the same credentials make less money and get inferior jobs to classmates who can network. But how does Jobs for the Future think about where networks fit in, and how can we create those for people who might not already have them?
It's a great question. And I think, it's important to think about how you can create social capital and social network across the board, right? For folks who are, a first gen college student at a elite four-year university, a student at a two-year community college, someone in a boot camp, right? So I think that this is something that's needed kind of regardless of what path the learner or the worker is taking. So we looked at this from the lens of how to support and build social capital for Black learners and workers who wanted to enter the tech field through a project that we've done with Comcast and the University of Phoenix. And so we have a framework that I encourage folks to take a look at, but it outlines really 5 different components of what building social capital really takes. So things that are kind of maybe the first things you think about, right? Building relationships through peer groups, through mentors. You mentioned Climb Higher. I think they do a great job of the peer cohort model. Building connections like outside of your network, helping with kind of onboarding into that first job, because we're seeing that's where a lot of, kind of fallout happens, is like actually once someone is employed and they don't have the supports within the employer setting, helping them like really look at ongoing learning opportunities, right? So there's really lots of different components to this. I think, as Ben's book points out, there are great nonprofits like Braven, where this is what they do. And they're an organization that works, I believe, both with 4- and 2-year colleges, I think, are primarily 4-year. But they're a terrific model. In the bootcamp space, Career Karma is a online tech platform that builds community through that platform, particularly for Black learners and workers. So I think there's nonprofits, there's tech startups, but I think what we are lacking though is like the system-wide, like comprehensive scale approach to solving this problem.
Can I respond? So I'd like to make the case slightly provocative. I think I believe it though, that actually policy shouldn't be focusing on social networks at all. And the reason is because if my friend helps me get a job, that's good for me, but somebody else didn't get the job. So it's not actually clear that it's increasing mobility on net. It's just creating different winners and losers. And we see this. There are some studies of job search assistance programs in the US and in other countries where they study the impact of a job referral on an individual who receives the referral. And yes, that's good for them. They get the job, they have some upward mobility. But when you study it at the labor market level, you look at markets where the referrals are happening versus ones that aren't. It actually turns out that the referrals displace other jobs. So you don't end up with more total employment in the areas where they're doing more referrals. You just displace some people and employ other people. And so we might have equity goals, might have equity reasons, as Maria mentions, to want to give networks to people who don't have them or whatever. But I don't think of that as a human capital strategy. I think of that as an inequality strategy. And what I would like to see is more investment in the total amount of skills that people have in the economy. I think like we're living longer, jobs are more complex. We ought to be spending more societal resources on education and less on other things, not like changing who gets the job and who doesn't. So.
Well, may I just say one thing? I mean, this is intriguing though, because David, you made earlier this very interesting point about the employer's perspective in a tight job market might be to have maximum flexibility and drop degree requirements, really out of self-interest more than out of some broader sense of the public good. But a student ought to be advised about what's going to help get them ahead, which would be likely be a degree or some kind of good, high quality, short-term stuff that can be combined into longer, bigger credentials. So if you take that same student-oriented perspective, and of course, I'm hoping that the message in the book will get to high school counselors and parents and teachers and some students, because I would really like them to get this broader perspective. And I think if you were talking to students, and I've for the book interviewed a lot of first-generation college students, you absolutely need to tell them. And I love that John read my footnotes. I mean, really, kudos to you. But
because I wrote that story.
Okay. Well, so I was footnoting only the highest quality higher ed journalism. But you want to tell people that degrees and credentials, high quality credentials, are necessary but not sufficient. That you need to know people. And as somebody, Ame Eubanks Davis, who's the founder of Braven, says, it's not just who you know, it's who knows you. So you go out and do an internship or a part-time job. People see that you have a good work ethic. You show up, you're on time, you do things correctly. That's going to help them recommend you for a job. And now I take your point. Okay, so not everything is going to be a net positive strategy for more skills existing. But I think it's absolutely worthwhile to get people without a lot of advantages to tell them it's not like I talked to a former college dean who said, some of her first gen students think it's kind of cheating to network, that it's somehow not really like a reputable path to success. And I think you just have to take all those unwritten rules and make them explicit. I think that's a really worthwhile thing to do.
I'm going to say, yeah, I mean, people should be out there hustling because everyone's doing it. I just don't think we ought to be spending taxpayer resources on trying to increase, because it's zero sum. That's all I was trying to say. But yes, I agree with you that as advice to individuals, yes, people should be building their social networks. Everyone's doing it.
So I want to make sure we have time for questions from you. Does anybody have a question?
Thanks for your book and thanks for all your comments. I'm really glad to hear that you're helping demystify some of the pathways that students and families need. So I think bringing in this information really helps sort of create a more equitable market for Europe, because there's not enough information on both sides. The question I have concerns costs, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time. And by adding on the sort of layering of vocational and degree and social capital, it seems like the message to the student is do more and more. And I'm wondering how to balance that against what is already a stressed system where families and students are already pressed as hard as they can be in order to find the time and money. So what trade-offs are needed, and what can institutions do as well to make this cost less in terms of their time?
Of course, I'm tempted to say, we have the academic dean of the Kennedy School here, who runs one institute. We have a couple of people who run institutions here. Maria is the CEO of Jobs for the Future. But I'll just say briefly, I don't think of this as being primarily about, people who are already strapped financially and stressed should be thinking about spending a lot more. I think it really is it goes back to this idea of a balanced diet and thinking about spending wisely, not spending more. And we know, unfortunately, because of the very significant non-completion problem, it's just like a lot of community college students have trouble. This is a slightly different issue, but it relates to resources, wasted credits that get earned but don't transfer because of challenges with that system. That's a lot of money that's being left on the table. And I think that if people think much more purposefully about how they're spending what they spend, they don't need to spend more, they just need to spend differently.
Yeah, we have a new report out called Success Redefined, which surveyed young people who actually chose not to go the traditional college route. And the 4 reasons that they listed, which probably are no surprise, was they want to get a credential faster, they don't want to be in debt, they want to be able to work while they're learning, and they're aiming for a certain kind of next job, right? So those were the 4 drivers. Personally, I think the winners of the future are kind of these hybrid models, whether it's Duet here in Boston with Southern New Hampshire University, or what Maria Aguiano at Arizona State is building, which she calls ASU Local, which is combining the power of ASU and a community college in communities surrounding Arizona. I think it's those models that are taking the best of various worlds and designing them in a very student-centered way that is where we're going to see the most success over time.
I'll just, since I was called on in my institutional role, I'll just say that, I think basically I accept the premise. I think colleges ought to be doing much more to help prepare and not be so high-minded about it, to prepare students for work. And not everybody comes to college for that, but most people do. And I don't actually think there's a tension between work-based learning opportunities and more high-minded pursuits in education. I think we can do both. And I would like to see schools like Harvard be more practical.
And I'm not actually on the panel, but let me also say that there are some institutions that are doing things like embedding certificates and micro-credentials in a bachelor's degree. So on your way, as soon as you accumulate enough credits, you get that certificate. And also, Maria mentioned Duet. The CEO of Duet is here if anybody wants to learn more about Duet, which coaches students on their way to bachelor's degrees. Other questions? Sir.
Really great talk and certain comments. My co-founder and I are actually building a readiness space. As part of that work, we encounter a lot of people with a lot of opinions on career management offices or career services offices at universities. Those opinions are almost always bad. I am of the opinion that it's sort of a losing battle. So I would love to see if you feel like there's a real solution to what seems to be a universal problem, or if the solution doesn't actually come from career management services.
Well, there was you probably have seen this if you're doing a startup in this area. Andy Chan, who's the director of career services at Wake Forest, is very good and did one of those kind of, I don't know if it was a TED talk or some kind of a thing that's on YouTube. It still got a lot of views 7 or 8 years later. It said something like blow up career services, and he had a lot of reforms, but I think it's actually had an impact on how people are thinking about career services. And part of that's starting it earlier. So it's not, okay, second semester, senior year, what am I going to do? Go and sign up for some campus interviews. It's trying to embed it much sooner. But I think that it relates to a couple of the themes here, and actually including social capital theme, which is, I think that like many things, first gen, lower income students often have fewer opportunities for things like internships, the kind of career related job experiences during college. And I think that professors can actually be more involved. They worry sometimes about they don't want to see themselves as doing job training. That's not our job. But I think without sort of undermining the core academic mission of the university, I think that there are things, I think I have in the book, I mentioned a professor at Wellesley who she's a neuroscientist, but she has sort of weekly senior capstone guest lectures from people in the field who come in. I think giving students more opportunities for internships and jobs earlier, talking about the connection between classroom and career earlier, without reinventing, it doesn't mean your industry has to write your curriculum, but I think it means you can simply be more aware in a real world sense. This is on students' minds, and you can give them opportunities to sort of figure out how to make those connections.
I think it's an area ripe for disruptions. I'm glad you're looking at it. Yes. When I dropped my daughter off at her nice liberal arts college, the head of career services got up and said, "We know what employers want." I was like, I don't think you do. But I my daughter here anyway.
So I don't actually, I wouldn't put the blame on career services. You're welcome. Yeah. I think it's more that the learning experience in colleges could be more adapted to the way that the workplace has changed. I don't have a everything needs to go kind of mentality about this. Maybe that's because I'm a college professor, so I have a self-interested reason not to be. But to me, it's, I don't know. I don't think the whole thing is broken. I think really people learn when they're engaged, and if you kind of close your eyes and picture what the modern workplace looks like, it doesn't look very much like a classroom. So I think there's a lot of things we could do in classrooms to build skills and teach people to learn the way that they will learn on the job. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with career services and placement, which is a very targeted thing. It's more about how do we prepare people for unpredictable team-based work environments, problem solving, switching kinds of roles, understanding how what you do fits into the larger organization. There's a lot of work we can do in professional schools. At the Kennedy School, we have a whole module of courses we call democratic leadership skills, teaching people how to negotiate, to learn across difference. And I think there's a lot more of that can be done without blowing up higher education, just kind of adapting it to the way that work has really changed. And that's what I would prefer to see.
I want to hear your question.
Well, I'm still listening, but thank you for asking. My question was just adding to your formula, your 3 C's. Where does career courses come into play in K-12 and graduate school? Where do the courses come in? And then you had already asked a question about the counselors per se. And I'm entirely biased. I've worked in career offices at multiple universities, business schools, and now I'm the associate director here at the Kennedy School's career office. We're understaffed, under-resourced. Faculty don't give us time in their classroom. And I have a dissertation to say I know what employers are looking for. So, but that's not the norm. So where do the courses come in? Because research also says it's 250 students to 1 counselor. So we're looking at data on counselors also not being trained, short staff. I think there's room to disrupt us and add to us. We have ideas, thoughts, but thinking about that in general. We talk about courses. But one last comment, the business schools that I've worked at all have a required career course. for their students, undergrad and grad, before they graduate. No other school, the other university part of you don't have a required class. So you don't just learn to network, you gotta be taught the science, the art of it. So just a thought on that.
One thing that comes to mind is Braven has actually had a lot of success. They've been very careful about not growing too fast. They're very popular, but they've just gradually added campuses. And Ame, the Eubanks Davis, their CEO, has told me that was very much a strategy of grow slow to grow well. And they have, to get to your point though, I was at Rutgers doing interviews for the book at Rutgers Newark campus. And they have a credit bearing course. And I think that's the model for most of their partnerships. They have a partnership with Spelman now. They have maybe San Jose State was one of their early partnerships. So I think that can be part of the formula. I guess I would just hesitate to say that must be it. I think that they've had success with that as an option. And arguably students, they're busy. It's hard to get them to engage. You are asking for a chunk of time commitment. Ben
and I actually were just talking the other day. Some universities are recognizing, because of the public skepticism over value and return on investment, the importance of career services and putting money into it. And I went down to Brown, where they spent 2 years revamping their career services office so that their students can start early with a course about how to get a job when they finish whatever it is they do at Brown. But other institutions like William and Mary's putting money into it. They actually connect you with a career advisor when you put down your deposit, not even before freshman orientation for undergraduates. And business schools, you're right, business schools are all doing this. But overall, investment in career services by universities has increased since 2020 because they're seeing the consumer demand.
The only thing that I want to add to this conversation is that I'm personally less focused on college's function as a way to place people into first jobs and much more focused on how do we educate people in a way that sets them up for 35 years of career success. And so I think the first job's important, but it's not fair to ask career services or anybody else to just do that. I think in the classroom and in the way we structure degree programs, we ought to be thinking about how do we set people up to be lifetime learners, to understand, to have the kind of skills that Ben was talking about that allow them to move across different types of jobs and really to build their own careers and become experts. So
I think I can kind of get on board with that. My concern is that as a country, we don't have a career navigation system, right? We have certain things that kind of are aligned with certain federal programs. And certainly don't think it's fair to put this on the career services, but it's a big gap I feel that we have as a society in terms of really helping folks, find their path, how they're going to finance that path and how they flourish along that path.
And even just the simple basics of how do you do this? How do you get the job?
Yeah.
Or how does your major connect to a job and what job? Because it's probably called something that came from a faculty member's doctoral dissertation title. So you don't really know how it connects. We, unfortunately, I know there's more questions and this is a huge topic. I know that Ben is willing to stay and field additional questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I'd like to thank the panelists and Ben. And thank you all for coming. And there's food in the back, I see. And sorry? And books in the back, of course, more importantly. And Ben, I'm sure will be delighted to answer any other questions. Thank you. Yeah.